Mr. Brattberg, let me come to you first. How do you look at the announcement that the US President Donald Trump is expected to pull out of the accord? Does this come as a surprise after all the time we have been hearing him saying this?
Probably not. We've heard candidate Trump at a campaign trail expressing skepticism of the Paris Agreement, and we've sort of seen the signals that a pullout would possibly eventually come. But of course it comes on top of European concerns about the broader US commitment to not only Europe but to also multilateralism and globalization, including his commitment to free trade, democracy and human rights issues, and NATO. So of course from a European perspective, it feeds into the skepticism that they already have about President Trump and the future of US foreign policy.
Dr. Heumann, I know the news just came out a couple of moments ago. I mean, probably it's too early to to have any real German media response to this, but what do you think the German media and the German government might react to this once it's officiated?
Once it's officiated. I really think this is very bad news, especially from a German point of view. Germany is one of the protagonists on this matter, and the Paris Agreement on climate change just brought I would call it a historic breakthrough in this field and in this situation. And I don't think it's politically very wise. So far, the U.S. could hide behind others who are reluctant to follow the agreement, but China has made progress on this. So I think it's a very bad issue, but it doesn't come as a surprise. And this I agree with my colleague here. Climate change was one of the two issues at the G7 meeting at the recent last week, which President Trump attended. And on both issues, Europeans were very deceived, were not happy with the US being reluctant on both globalization, free trade, and on climate change. It doesn't come as a surprise. The German Chancellor, had hoped that the issue could be decided later at the G20 meeting in Hamburg, but obviously the President might decide before that.
Now, we already heard about this kind of ongoing feud between Germany and basically between Europe and the United States. Mr. Brattberg, how do you think the announcement of the US administration to pull out of the Paris climate change deal would make things worse? By what degree?
Well, as my colleague said, climate change policy is a huge priority for the Europeans. So this feeds into the skepticism that they already have about the Trump administration. And this comes, of course, again, on top of the president's trip to Europe, which in many ways was a public diplomacy disaster. Europeans paid attention to his failure to actively endorse Article 5 at the NATO summit, his tough words about Germany and its trade surplus. So it really feeds into an existing skepticism that Europeans already had about Donald Trump and about US foreign policy. But at the same time, Europe has very few options but to continue to engage the United States. And I think we've seen, even though Merkel is criticizing Trump and also saying that Europe needs to do more on its own, she also recognizes that there aren't that many other options than continuing to engage the United States. And in fact, the Chancellor has been very active in developing those types of relationships with President Trump, visiting Washington and frequently speaking to him. So I think we're going to see, on the one hand, continued efforts for Europe to step up its own game, but also efforts to continue to engage the Trump administration, even where there are differences, and looking for areas where there might be similarities and potential for cooperation, even though the times are very difficult.
Yeah, Mr. Brattberg, still to you, has this feud been a surprise to you? I mean, in the past, we've seen that the United States, for instance, spying on Mrs. Merkel's cell phone or using the US's diplomatic institution in Germany as a kind of intelligence headquarters, but we never heard this kind of strong words coming back from the German authorities towards what the US has been saying. What makes it so special, so different this time?
Well, I'm not sure that it actually does. I think the Chancellor has said similar things in the past, that there is a need for Europe to reduce its complete reliance, as she put it, on the United States. That's not a controversial thing to say. Other European leaders have said the same thing. And to call for more European self-reliance. That's also not a controversial thing. Of course, the timing is what we're all paying attention to. But I think it's important not to put this out of its context and to make too much of a big deal about it. Germany remains committed to the transatlantic relationship, perhaps more so than most European countries. And I think we'll continue to engage the United States. And even though Trump has said these things about Germany, which are very unfortunate in German ears, the United States, even under Donald Trump, has continued the very active relationship with Berlin, similar to the way Obama handled Europe, calling on Berlin, trying to work with Germany. So obviously this is not good for the relationship. It puts a lot of strain on the German-US and the broader US-European relationship, but I think we're gonna be able to continue engaging even at the highest level despite these type of comments.
Dr. Heumann, what is the German view here? Do you and your German colleagues observe similar kind of expectation for continued cooperation despite the rifts that we have seen over the past few days?
Yes, there's no doubt that cooperation will go on, but let me say the following about the two remarks, the statements of the Chancellor. Yes, some politicians have said it before, but I think the Chancellor, for the first time, is very clear, because she does not only refer to NATO or to something, but to something which you could call the liberal order. When she said times are gone that you can rely on others, she meant we as Europe, and the others, she meant the US. And both form the liberal order. And the liberal order is based on institutions such as NATO and G7, based on norms such as free trade. And it's dependent on US leadership. So she was saying nothing less that the US president might put into doubt the liberal orders as we know it. And then as a consequence, second statement, that Europe has to take its destiny in its own hands. This is a very substantial statement by the Chancellor, who is not known for very clear statements. She's talking about the liberal order. She's talking about NATO. Europeans expected a clear commitment of the US president to collective defense, to Article 5. They didn't have it. A clear commitment to free trade, which was not given. So this is something serious, I would say.
Finally, very briefly, Dr. Heumann, to you again, how do you see the future possible direction that Germany could look into elsewhere, apart from the United States? Do you think she has an idea when she said that Germany could look somewhere else?
Germany will not turn away from the United States, but she was talking about Europe and taking. What does she mean when she says Europe has to take its own destiny in its own hands? Europe, the Brexit. Europe is said to be in a crisis, but actually, Brexit has encouraged Europe to go ahead, perhaps with different speeds. You had just the elections in France with a pro-European president. You have Chancellor Merkel. They already developed some initiatives about further integrating the Eurozone. There will be some initiatives on security issues. There will be a new relationship between EU defense and NATO. So this is the time now that Europe can go ahead with some of the initiatives already discussed in the past. But that's what she meant. Not turning away from the US, but strengthening Europe.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Now, that was Mr. Erik Brattberg from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Dr. Hans-Dieter Heumann, former president of the Federal College for Security Policy.